following podcast is for informational purposes only. The contents of this podcast do not constitute tax, legal, or investment advice. Take responsibility for your own decisions, consult with the proper professionals, and do your own research.
It's very important for any application to have quality data that is uncensorable and unhackable. So the graph does a really good job of that, and it's a great solution to a problem, and it's a very difficult problem to solve. That's why the graph is really the only team that I've seen with a solution right now in the market that's usable.
We're like astronauts floating in the space of time.
Welcome to the GRTIQ podcast. Today I'm speaking with David, a Subgraph Developer and Curator at the Graph, who works with the Synthetix and Kwenta teams. In addition to being a user of the Graph, Synthehtix has been a close partner with the community for a long time, and David has played an important role. Our conversation covers many topics, including David's diverse background, his passion for Ethereum, what Synthetix does, this new project Cuenta, and how they both leverage the graph. We started the conversation talking about David's educational and professional background.
Well, first, I have allergies right now. I don't always sound like this, but anyway, just putting a disclaimer out there. I've had 3 careers. So my first career was environmental management. I worked for a big aerospace company in the US. Then I worked in real estate finance and development. I worked for one of the biggest private equity groups in New York at their largest subsidiary in Florida. And then I really didn't like working in real estate finance that much. It was very corporate. I wanted to do something a little bit more on the tech side. So I started learning how to code about 6-7 years ago. And it took me a little bit of time to get up to speed, but eventually I switched over to tech. I started a media company, went to a computer vision company, and then maybe like 4 years ago, I switched into blockchain. So I've been doing blockchain about 4 to 5 years, and I started out mostly on the front end for a company called Nash, which is a decentralized cross-chain exchange. And then I became really obsessed with Ethereum maybe like 2 years ago. So I started studying Ethereum in depth. So I ended up having a connection of mine that was at Synthehtix. So I reached out to them, and I was an investor in Synthehtix well before I joined. So I was familiar with the protocol and a big fan of the project, and I still am. I think there's a lot of upside, a lot of room for growth. So I joined Synthehtix, and then I've been there for the past year and a half. And now at Synthehtix, I was one of the people on the team who built Kwenta, which Kwenta.io is the website where you can interact with the Synthehtix protocol. So you can use it to trade derivatives offered by Synthehtix. And Kwenta is now being spun out as a separate team. So I am leaving Synthehtix and joining Kwenta. And what I'll be doing in Kwenta is we're aiming to build the best interface for interacting with Synthehtix. And then also now we have a new goal, which is to drive value to the Kwenta token. So in the last month alone, before we've launched layer 2, which the transactions will be infinitely cheaper, and before we've launched our futures product, which will add margin trading, Kwenta did $1.3 billion in volume last month. So we think it's a really big opportunity. We think that, our goal is the sky's the limit and just to build the best exchange in the world. And the graph is a part of that. Whatever we do with our contracts at Kwenta, we're going to be using the graph to read the data, just like Synthehtix uses it for all of their contracts. And when I was at Synthehtix, I did work on the front end, but I was also heavily involved with the subgraph. So that was kind of my main responsibility, was to make sure that every time we had a lot of contracts that were regularly being updated. So when you have this sort of like architecture where you're not just like set it and forget it, it's actually quite complicated to work with Subgraph. Plus, we have multiple networks that we try to support. So now you have very large subgraphs across multiple networks. So yeah, that's kind of how I started getting involved with the graph. And then I joined the curator program, and now I curate on the synthetic subgraphs that I created.
So it's common for a guest of the podcast to have some type of draw to Ethereum. And I'm curious about yours. What is it about Ethereum that drew you in and caused you to be obsessed with it?
Well, Ethereum is like, it's just a special project. I think it has the best community in the world. Just like the smartest people who care about the world and want to make it a better place. And that being said, at the same time, it's a world of financial abundance and wealth and growth, right? So I think it's made a lot of people very wealthy, a lot of creators and builders and investors, people who shape the world. And I think a lot of people are coming together and building on Ethereum and creating this very unique environment. And if you look at Vitalik, he's just kind of a one-of-a-kind founder where he's not really in it for the money. I mean, he's made it, and who knows what he's really in it for, but like, he never comes across that way. It always seems like he's just out for the best outcome for the world and community. He's donated a lot of money. I mean, I just think it's a very innovative project that will be the cornerstone of Web3. It'll be, the settlement layer for the world. It's only going to get bigger and bigger, and what's not to like about it, So that's kind of, I'm a huge fan. I love it.
So a guy like you, with your background and the different things you've done in your life, at some point you made a decision to go all in on crypto, and it's so early. I'm just curious, why take that risk? Why enter the crypto space?
Well, I just thought it was a lot more interesting to me. Because it's kind of like this black box of where things are going. Why crypto? Try to explain it to your friends and family who aren't technical. What's a blockchain? What's crypto? Why is it useful? And then on top of that, like, you can't just learn about the technology side. You have to understand what is money? How does money work? So there's all these rabbit holes to go down. It's a very fascinating field. And even the graph, like, why does the graph exist? What is the graph? Like, these are all very complicated questions that there's no easy answer for, right? So when you have all this complexity, it just opens the door for a lot of innovation that's even unexpected, right? So like, now you have NFT mania, right? Like Bored Ape Yacht Club. And all these things are on Ethereum, So look, in terms of my main focus, it's I like DeFi a lot. I think Synthetics is a very interesting project where derivatives trading is so much larger than the spot volume in traditional finance. And I think crypto could soon have that moment where derivatives just accelerates exponentially. So, kind of what I would like to do is to have Kwenta be the best place to trade derivatives and sort of present the best user experience. And then from there, there's a million things we can do with the project. But, we just want to nail one thing at a time and have the best futures interface, have the best place for shorting, have the best place just to go spot if you want to, move in between synths or derivatives contracts. So, it's already doing quite well, but we think there's still like exponential growth ahead if we can deliver.
Let's spend a minute and just kind of break down the two entities that brought you to the graph and that you've already mentioned, Cuenta and Synthetics. Let's start with Synthetics. What would you, or how would you describe Synthetics to maybe somebody who is new to the space or doesn't quite understand crypto?
Yeah. So Synthetics is a way for you to bet on the price of an asset moving without actually owning that asset. So that's essentially what a derivative contract is. So let's say that I want exposure to Apple. The nice thing about Ethereum is it's open for anyone in the world with an internet connection. So you can have people who use Apple products in other countries who can't buy Apple stock because of regulation. So now these people have the ability to buy synthetic Apple or other assets that weren't available to them. Now, they could also go into synthetic ETH, or they could hold ETH itself. Now, one of the things that's coming out soon is called futures, which allows you to do leverage trading. This is a very popular product. People want to lever up their ETH bet. They think it's going to go up. I don't know if you saw FTX just cap their leverage upside to 20x instead of 100x. So there is like maybe too much leverage, but there's still a lot of demand for some leverage on a trade. So I think futures and using derivatives is a great way to get exposure because you don't get slippage on price. So if you trade against Synthetics, you're getting the price of the asset no matter what happens. Like if you have a huge order, there's no slippage on your trade, right? So there's a lot of benefits to trading on the Synthetics protocol. And it's a nice way to make a bet on a variety of assets that we offer. Essentially, you can go short or long, or soon you'll have futures where you can leverage up your bet.
And so let's introduce Kwenta then. So how would you explain then the relationship between Kwenta and Synthetics?
Right. So Kwenta was spawned from Synthetics. Kwenta is an interface for trading, right? And as that becomes more popular, you have, just like any website, right? Google.com, Facebook.com, you can monetize your volume or your traffic. So the goal of Kwenta is to kind of start out with Synthetics, make it an incredible trading experience, and then add products on top, such as like limit orders on top of Synthetics derivatives. Right now with Synthetics, you have to make market orders. So if ETH is trading at $2,200 and you want to go into the synthetic ETH, you have to buy it at $2,200. You can't say, well, I'm going to set an order for $1,900 and forget about it. And if the market crashes, it'll just pick it up for me, right? So we're going to be adding features like that, which will drive value to the Kwenta token, right? So we're very confident we can drive tremendous amounts of volume and then have a small percentage of that be captured by the Kwenta token as well. But there's a lot of work to do. So we're going to take it one step at a time and really just make the trading experience as good as possible. That's the number one goal. So, we get more users then.
So what is your role at Kwenta then?
I do a little bit of everything on the tech side. Be working on the smart contracts, the subgraphs, and the user interface. So kind of across the board, everything.
So David, part of the reason you and I are talking today is listeners of the podcast are very interested in use cases behind the graph. And so I've been reaching out to people like you and others on how you use the graph and how important it is to what you're doing. Can you take a minute and maybe describe the way that Synthetics and maybe even Kwenta leverages the graph?
Sure. So basically, anytime we want to get a user's historical data for interacting with the Synthetics protocol, or if we want to get statistics on Synthetics data. So if you go to stats.synthetics.io, I also built that initial version. Actually, there's the guy who is replacing me at Synthetics also worked on the stat site now. So he's kind of taking over the responsibilities I had. But basically, when you show like total trading volume and number of users, number of transactions over a given time period, all of these things require historical data from Ethereum, right? So you need some source of this historical data for your users. Like also on like the Kwenta site, like all your trades that you've made in the past, right? You need to show that to the user. So what we do is whenever there's data that's older, you can't just ping like an Infura node and say, give me all this historical data. You have to go to something called an archive node. But if you just go to Infura and say, give me an archive node, I'm going to query it, then you're dealing with the centralized provider. So your users have basically now a vector to shut down their interface for interacting with Ethereum, right? So they're not going to be able to get that data if Ethereum says, hey, I'm not serving this data anymore. So because Ethereum is an unstoppable platform for smart contracts, it's also really nice to put your website on IPFS and to pull historical data from the graph. Now, if you do all of these things, you slowly become an unstoppable interface for not just for the smart contract side, but also for the client and for the data that you're reading from Ethereum. So the graph's a really important project, I think. I don't know anybody else who's a competitor of theirs that has any traction in the Ethereum community. As well, they're going cross-chain. So I think the graph is here to stay, and I think they're going to be a powerhouse in the ecosystem because it's a very technical thing they're doing. They have a really good tech team, the graph does. So I feel like it's a great project, it's a great hold as a coin. I still have a bunch I'm curating, trying to make sure that the subgraphs we push out have GRT curated on them.
I want to ask you more about your curation experience, but before I do, why not create your own archive node and just do this for yourself? Like, what prevents a user of the graph from just creating their own in-house solution?
Right. So we could do that. What it is it's more robust and it's really hard to censor it. So it's a decentralized network of indexers that serve data. So it's really hard for a government to show up at somebody's house and say, hey, you can't provide Ethereum data to people anymore. But somebody could go to Infura and say, you're shut down, and then nobody can use Ethereum front end. So then everyone would have to deploy their own. And then it becomes a question of how do you, it just becomes a problem for the entire ecosystem. Everyone has to manage things one by one. And then some solutions will be good. Maybe some people can hack my service and send back fake results, tricking people into doing things in the UI, spending money in ways that they wouldn't expect. So it's a serious issue. I remember I was interacting with a protocol once and the UI was giving me the wrong data. So I did something that was actually not what I would do if I had the correct information. So it is a very important issue for users, actually.
So how important is the graph? And you kind of touched on this a little bit, but how important would you say the graph is to Synthetix and Kwenta?
It's a critical part of our infrastructure almost as much as Ethereum, but not to the same level. Obviously, that's like our foundational layer. But yeah, just like, a browser is really important for users. I think the graph is sort of like a really important toolkit for any Ethereum developer.
The GRTIQ podcast is made possible by a generous grant from the Graph Foundation. The Graph Grants program provides support for protocol infrastructure, tooling, dApps, subgraphs, and community building efforts. Learn more at thegraph.foundation. That's thegraph.foundation.
Hi, this is GRTIQ. Each week, we get to meet a new member of the Graph community and ecosystem. The goal here is to take listeners inside the Graph by telling the stories and sharing the insights of those helping to build it. Please consider supporting this project by leaving a review wherever you listen to the GRTIQ podcast or by sharing episodes on social media. And don't forget to visit grtiq.com/podcast for detailed show notes. That's grtiq.com/podcast. Thanks for listening.
Thank you for your support.
So you wrote you developed the subgraphs for Synthetix, and I would love to know a little bit about what it's like to write a subgraph. How would you describe what a subgraph is, and what's the process of going about creating one?
Sure. So, yeah, a subgraph is basically a way for a developer to take Ethereum data and sort of massage it into the format that they need in order to efficiently request that data from their interface. So like from Kwenta.io, we have to show certain data like transaction history. So a subgraph is a really nice way to look at all the transactions people have submitted and to take it and to save it in a way that's usable for us, right? And also to aggregate it. So we don't want a user to log in and like have to read all of Ethereum and then aggregate data or do certain things. We want it to be like this. Like you open the app and it just loads. It has all the fields. Everything's pre-calculated and stored. And so a nice way to do that is to have a backend database, which basically has like all of the entities that you need pre-formatted. You just request them and then you serve it to the app. So the graph is basically a database. It's not like you're just taking the data from Ethereum. Certainly you can pull the data off Ethereum and just save it in the same format. But most people like want to name their entities, want to like maybe combine different entities, want to like say, give me the daily volume for Kwenta every day, like the last 30 days and create a chart. So if you want to do that, it becomes very difficult if you don't have the data stored in a table where it's already kind of like inputted as here's today's volume. And then if the day's ongoing and you make a trade, it just adds it to that column as like it adds whatever. So if you have $1 million in volume that day, then you have another $1 million trade come in, that row in the table just updates the 2 million and you query it directly instead of having to get every transaction that happens from the client that day and then do the calculation in the client.
What's your experience been as a curator in the graph who actually signals GRT on a subgraph they develop?
So I think it's common. I think, if you're at a protocol where it's popular, so a lot of queries are going to come your way, it only makes sense to curate early. But there are bots on the curation network that actually made a lot of profit off of our curation. So when we deployed ours, I went to go to curate and I saw the amount of shares I would get. And then it was like a third less by the time I actually got it to go through. Because you have slippage and there's all these things going on in the UI that actually make it a little bit difficult to beat the bots or to even get your curation in. That being said, like, I'm still glad I did it. It's so far, I expect it to grow as Synthetics. Right now, we're not even using our subgraph on the decentralized network. We're still testing it out. So we haven't hooked up the dApps to it yet. But once the queries start coming in, I expect a lot more people to curate on the subgraph.
What's your advice to listeners that want to be a curator and don't necessarily have the technical capabilities that you personally have?
Yeah, look, I would say just be a delegator probably, because being a curator, it's complicated. There's all sorts of rules. And if you're playing games against bots, you're probably going to get fleeced or lose. Even if you don't lose big, you probably won't win. So I would say that you could play the game, but study a lot before you do.
What's the experience you've personally had in interacting with members of the graph community, whether it's indexers or people helping you maybe early on setting up the synthetic subgraphs and things like that?
Well, the graph is a very close friend of Synthetics. I believe the founders of Synthetics are seed investors to the graph. So, also Justin, who's sort of one of the lead core contributors, he is on the graph council. So we're very close with them, and we provide a lot of feedback as we see things or if we have questions, we ask questions. We have a private channel with the graph team. So it's been very good, and their developers are very qualified. So they always know the answer to all the questions, which is pretty great.
So as a guy who is very interested in DeFi, you already said that's something that kind of excites you. It makes sense. You're working on Synthetics and Kwenta, which are DeFi products. How does the graph fit into, in your own mind, how does the graph fit into the DeFi world? Is it an important piece of infrastructure Is there going to need to be something like the graph for DeFi to exist?
Yeah. So like I said, with the unstoppable backend, aka Ethereum, nobody can really change your Ethereum data. Like they'd have to have your private key, right? So as a user, you want to make sure that it's not just the backend that's secure. You want your front end to be secure too. And like I said, part of that is getting quality data in an efficient way. So, it's really hard to do that with centralized service providers. It's not reliable. Any person in the world can live in a country where they decide to censor the applications that you interact with. And so if they do that, then how are you going to make sure that you could use the protocol that you've been using, right? Like, this is your money at work, and you don't want people to take that away from you. So it's not the same as Ethereum, where it's like an unstoppable source of data that you're submitting transactions to, but the read side is equally important as the write side. As I said before, it's very important for any application to have quality data that is uncensorable and unhackable. So the graph does a really good job of that. And it's a great solution to a problem. And it's a very difficult problem to solve. That's why the graph is really the only team that I've seen with a solution right now in the market that's usable.
I like to ask people I interview that are in the DeFi space how DeFi impacts everyday people. So you're in the space, you're a technical guy, you understand a lot about DeFi that, your friends and family may not. But yet in a DeFi environment, maybe they benefit in ways that they don't understand or would appreciate. How would you describe the everyday person's benefit in a DeFi world?
It's a very complex topic, right? Because you could say that the traditional financial markets really take advantage of people in terms of like, you're always basically losing a little bit when you're trading against Wall Street. If you're doing call options or whatever, you're going through your provider and you don't really know like what you're getting or how the other side is beating you on the trade. I feel like a lot of people lose in ways they don't understand to very complicated actors. Now, you could say Ethereum solves that because it provides a very open, transparent ecosystem. Also, you're not dealing with people who are siphoning fees off the top. You're dealing with bots and computers that basically only require a small amount of money to process stuff, right? But when you get into it, there's minor extractable value. There's all sorts of complicated things going on in Ethereum. So, I really don't think, the way I think of Ethereum is like, it's building a free and open financial system. My biggest takeaway is like, what's the biggest benefit to the world? Forget about it, like an individual person. It's like, it allows for freedom to exist in the world. And the reason why I think that is because, let's say you took away cash from the world today. So if you only had electronic money, they've already kind of talked about this in a few places, but like, what does that look like? Like, look at China, right? You have basically everything is tracked. They know everything you do. You have a score which will go up or down based upon the activities that you do or the things that you buy. So if you buy things that the government doesn't like, they could really shut you out of society. So how do you escape that? You have to have a way to have money exist outside of the control of a centralized party like the government. Now, cash is great. Cash allows for freedom today, but you've already kind of seen people without understanding what it means be like, we don't need cash anymore. Cash is old, right? Like, let's all switch to digital stuff. So in a world where there's like a CBDC, where there's no crypto and no cash, that's like not a free world, in my opinion. But at the same time, cash is like old news. I don't think cash is really that great. So I'd be fine with getting rid of cash as long as we have crypto. Because in my opinion, if you don't have crypto, you lose economic freedom. And from there, it spirals into this dystopian nightmare. So I think it's essential for freedom. And then beyond that, I think, the goal, whether we're there today or not, is to create all these financial primitives that can be the foundation of finance for the entire world. And my take on it is like, will China itself use all these protocols? Probably not, but they're very heavy into blockchain, automation of finance. Like, they see the benefits of like having instant transactions, more trust, like not having a single bank control everything. Maybe it's that bank, but they have like 10,000 computers around the country that are secured, right? So it's very hard to hack into it. And yet all the other countries aren't going to want to interface with China's blockchain. So the US can have their blockchain, but how are they going to do international trade via these automated systems? It's all going to pass through Ethereum, in my opinion. So I view Ethereum as kind of like the global settlement layer, where like as things flow in and out of different countries, it'll all happen. Ethereum will be kind of like the middleware, like the middle layer for all international trade. And then when you have a free country like the US or, Europe or different parts of the world, those citizens can use Ethereum too. And you can choose to, use a Coinbase where you like give them your funds, or you can custody your own funds. And I think what's going to happen in the near future is, beyond just like getting rid of these middlemen on Wall Street that like rake in so many of the fees for the financial system, you're going to have way better products. You're going to have way better apps, way more investment opportunities, and you'll see novel products coming out like NFTs, social clubs. Like, it's a blank canvas and people are painting on it. And in traditional finance, it's really hard to innovate because you have a lot of regulations, you have a lot of costs, everything is siloed, right? So if Bank of America invents a really cool financial product and Citigroup creates something entirely different, those live in their own world. But in Ethereum, you can have a UI that kind of brings both those elements together, or you could build a third contract that kind of ties those together and then build something entirely new that you never even thought possible before. So I just think that like the sky's the limit in terms of innovation. And when you have so much innovation, it's inevitable to me that the world will use the best products eventually. So eventually everyone in the world will be using crypto products. And I don't think Ethereum is the only chain that's going to win. I think it'll be the biggest, but I also think Bitcoin is here to stay. I think there's some long-term security issues that they need to figure out if it's not going to be a transactional hub, because as the mining rewards for mining blocks goes down, and transaction fees need to go up in order to sustain the mining power, I think that's going to be a problem maybe, but I still think Bitcoin is going to be around for a long time. I think Solana will do really well. I think, projects like the Graph, like Chainlink, like Thorchain are all going to do very well in this cross-chain world that will continue to grow. But I do think Ethereum's kind of like the sun that sucks in all the gravity that the whole thing revolves around. Hi, this is David Schwartz with Kwenta, and I'm a curator at The Graph. If my conversation with the GRTIQ podcast has been helpful to you, then please consider supporting future episodes by becoming a subscriber. Visit grtiq.com/podcast for more information. That's grtiq.com/podcast, and thank you for listening.
GRTIQ
Podcast.
You've hit on this a couple times, and I just want to make one more pass at it. And it's this idea of why it's so important for people like Synthetix and Kwenta to use a decentralized partner to query data from the chain. So can you just kind of hit on that again of why it's so important to have a decentralized solution for that service?
Yeah. So let's say you go to Kwenta.io and you're looking at your transaction history, or let's say you go to stats.synthetix.io and you're looking at historical data for the protocol. How much volume has there been? What's happening in the ecosystem over the last week? And a lot of times people make trading decisions based upon their data, or they need their transaction history for taxes. So you really need to have historical data in order for your app to be usable, to be understandable, to gain insights for users. And you can't have that data be vulnerable to being shut down or to inaccessible, right? Or to have the wrong data. And the graph does a really good job of providing an ecosystem for having that data in the right format that you need it in, that's secure and provided by unidentifiable parties all over the world. So it's kind of like unstoppable data in the sense that Ethereum is unstoppable contracts, but you're not like, you're going to write your data to Ethereum and then you're going to read it. It's still the Ethereum data, but you're storing it in the graph with the indexers and reading it from them.
As I understand it, as a non-technical person, Ethereum and other chains are not inherently searchable. They're not well-constructed databases. And so somebody needs to come along and play that liaison role. Do I have that right, or where do I have it wrong?
No, that's right. So the goal of an Ethereum node is not to have people query all of the data, right? It's to make sure that the latest head is up to date and that the network can be synced, that your transaction can be settled. They pass on the responsibility for providing data to interfaces to something called an archive node, which has all of that historical data that you can request from. Now, the archive node is useful, but like I said, you're going to a centralized party and saying, hey, you have to manage this infrastructure. It's not easy to manage it. It's like, I don't know how many terabytes or whatever. It's a lot of data, right? So you need to have full uptime on a very data intensive server. And to do that, it's not easy, right? Synthetix has an infrastructure guy that we run our own for our internal development process. But having somebody like Infura is very helpful for the ecosystem. That being said, it's expensive to use Infura archive nodes. And on top of that, they could be shut down at any time. And then everyone in the ecosystem would have to scramble for another solution, which kind of like the solution for that problem is the graph. So now you have data that's not just formatted like an archive node, but you have control as a developer for how the data is saved in the backend. So it's kind of like you're creating your own backend, and you're saving things exactly the way you want it, and you're querying them exactly the way you want to query them. But you don't have to run the infrastructure. That's taken care of by a decentralized set of indexers.
David, thank you so much for your time and telling us more about Synthetix and Kwenta. If people are interested in following you or learning more about what you're working on, what's the best way to do it?
I go by Alex the Bored Ape on Twitter, so people can follow me there. People can follow Kwenta on Twitter. I think that's a really good avenue. You can join the Kwenta Discord. So if you go to Kwenta.io, there should be a link to that. Look, I think we're at the very early stages of on-chain derivatives, and Kwenta will be sort of one of the early scaling solutions using Optimism, which will be a layer 2 solution for Ethereum that uses optimistic rollups. And we're very confident that our product, once we switch to L2, will be much, much better than the current L1 experience where you have to pay insane fees for everything. So our goal is to provide a trading experience where you can use derivative products like futures or shorts, or even just entering into synthetic assets like SETH or SBTC without paying the egregious slippage fees that you might pay on other exchanges. So, right now it's a little bit expensive to use Kwenta, but we are launching using optimistic Ethereum exchanging. It's going to be limited to a few assets to start, but over time we'll be adding more and more synths, and then we'll add futures products in the near future, and also shorts as well will be available on L2 as well soon.
This has been a production of the GRT IQ podcast. For more information, including detailed show notes, visit grtiq.com/podcast. That's grtiq.com/podcast.
Please consider contributing to this project and helping build the community by subscribing and leaving a review.
GRT IQ
Podcast.